The doctor's words hit me like a physical blow as I sat in the sterile examination room, my hands gripping the edges of the plastic chair so hard my knuckles turned white. She repeated herself, speaking slowly as if I hadn't heard correctly the first time. The toxicology report was positive. My blood work showed traces of thallium, a heavy metal poison, accumulated over months, not days. My entire body went rigid. I couldn't breathe properly. "How is this possible?" I heard myself ask, but my voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The doctor leaned forward, her expression shifting from clinical concern to something deeper, alarm mixed with confusion. She explained that thallium didn't appear in food or water naturally. Someone had to put it there deliberately. The realization crashed through me like an avalanche. Someone in my life had been poisoning me for months. Every single day, I'd been consuming something lethal, and I hadn't even known. I left the hospital in a daze, my car keys heavy in my trembling hand. The parking lot seemed to spin around me, even though I was standing perfectly still. 58 years old, and I suddenly felt like my entire world had been built on quicksand. The life I thought I was living, stable, predictable, safe, had been a lie the whole time. Someone close to me had been slowly, methodically, trying to kill me. My name is Hara Richards, and this is the story of how I discovered that the person I trusted most had been poisoning my food every single day. I'd been feeling unwell for what felt like forever. The exhaustion started about 8 months ago, creeping in gradually like a fog that wouldn't lift. At first, I blamed it on age, on the natural decline that comes with getting older. My hair began falling out in clumps during my morning showers. I'd wake up to find strands wrapped around my fingers, and I'd stare at them in the mirror with growing dread. My nails became brittle and pale. My skin developed strange rashes that wouldn't respond to any cream or medication. But the worst part was the confusion. I'd walk into rooms and forget why I was there. I'd lose track of conversations mid-sentence. I started making mistakes at work that I'd never made before. I'm a financial advisor, or at least I was. I've spent 30 years building my reputation, working with clients to help them plan their retirements, manage their investments, navigate the complexities of estate planning. It's work that requires precision, attention to detail, and absolute clarity of mind. The mental fog was terrifying because it threatened everything I'd built. I went to my regular doctor first. He ran standard blood work, found nothing alarming, and suggested it was stress or early menopause symptoms, even though I was well past that stage. He prescribed vitamins and told me to get more sleep. I followed his advice religiously. I went to bed earlier. I took the supplements. Nothing changed. If anything, I felt worse. My daughter Oliella had moved back home 6 months ago. She was going through a difficult divorce, and I'd insisted she stay with me while she got back on her feet. Oliella had always been close to me, and seeing her struggle broke my heart. I wanted to help her, to provide stability while her life was falling apart. She'd been handling most of the cooking since she arrived, wanting to contribute to the household, she said. I was grateful for it. The exhaustion had made even simple tasks feel impossible. She'd prepare my breakfast before I left for work. She'd have dinner waiting when I came home. She'd even started packing my lunch for the office, arranging everything in neat containers with careful labels. I never questioned it. Why would I? She was my daughter. I loved her. She was going through a crisis, and I was trying to be the supportive mother I'd always been. The day before I went to the hospital, I'd collapsed at work. I was in a client meeting, discussing portfolio allocations, when the room started spinning. My vision blurred. My hands went numb. I managed to excuse myself and made it to the bathroom before everything went black. My colleague Islaina found me on the floor 20 minutes later. She called an ambulance. The paramedics arrived within minutes, and suddenly I was being rushed to the emergency room, my heart monitor beeping frantically as they worked on me. That's when things got serious. The emergency room doctor ordered comprehensive testing. They did an EKG, chest x-rays, blood work, everything. The initial results suggested poisoning. They'd never seen anything quite like it. The symptoms didn't match any single toxin they'd encountered recently. They called in a toxicologist, a specialist named Rayton Stewart, who'd been working in the Poison Control Center for 20 years. He sat with me for hours, asking detailed questions about my diet, my environment, my daily routines. He wanted to know everything I ate, everything I drank, everything I touched. He asked about my family. He asked about my home. He asked about my relationships. That's when I told him about Oliela. I didn't suspect her. Not really. I was just mentioning that she'd been cooking for me, that she'd been helping around the house. I watched Rayton's expression change. He asked me to describe exactly what she prepared for me, how often, what ingredients she used. He wanted to know if anyone else in the house was experiencing similar symptoms. I told him Oliela seemed fine. She was healthy, energetic, eating the same foods I was eating. At least, I thought she was. Now I wasn't sure about anything. The toxicology report came back positive for thallium. Rayton explained that thallium was a colorless, odorless, tasteless heavy metal. It could be dissolved in liquids or mixed into food without anyone knowing. It accumulated in the body over time, causing exactly the symptoms I'd been experiencing: hair loss, brittle nails, skin problems, neurological issues. In high enough doses, it could cause organ failure, seizures, death. The amount they found in my system suggested someone had been giving me small, consistent doses for months. It was methodical. It was calculated. It was attempted murder. I sat in that hospital bed, and my entire life reorganized itself around that single, horrifying fact. Everything I thought I knew was wrong. The person I'd opened my home to, the person I'd been trying to help, had been systematically poisoning me. The police arrived at the hospital that evening. Detective Oweniel Marquez was a tall woman with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she'd seen the worst of humanity and wasn't particularly surprised by it anymore. She sat across from me in the hospital room, her notebook open, her pen poised. She asked me to start from the beginning. I told her everything. I told her about Oliela's divorce, about how she'd moved in, about how she'd taken over the cooking. I told her about the months of declining health. I told her about the symptoms that had slowly worsened. I told her about the collapse at work. Detective Marquez listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked a single question. "Has your daughter ever asked you about your will?" The question hit me like a punch. I hadn't thought about it. I'd never considered that angle. But now, looking back, I realized that yes, she had asked. Several times. She'd mentioned that I should probably update my estate documents, that I should make sure everything was in order. She'd suggested I talk to an attorney about my financial arrangements. At the time, I'd thought she was being thoughtful, mature, responsible. Now I understood. She'd been fishing. She'd been checking to see if I'd already changed my will, if I'd already made her a beneficiary. "I need to search your home," Detective Marquez said. "I need to examine your kitchen, your food storage, everything. And I need to speak with your daughter." I called Oliela from the hospital. I told her that the doctors had found something unusual in my blood work and that the police needed to ask her some questions. I watched her face on the video call, looking for some sign of guilt, some flicker of recognition. She seemed confused, concerned. She asked if I was okay. She said she'd come to the hospital right away. She said she couldn't believe this was happening. She sounded like a loving daughter worried about her mother. I wanted to believe her. Some part of me desperately wanted there to be another explanation, some horrible misunderstanding that would make sense of all this. But Detective Marquez was already on her way to my house. The toxicology report didn't lie. The poison didn't appear by accident. When the police arrived at my home, they found exactly what they were looking for. In Oliella's bedroom, hidden in a locked box under her bed, they discovered a container of thallium powder. There were also detailed notes, dates, quantities, observations about how I was responding to the doses. She'd been tracking my decline like a scientist conducting an experiment. There were also printouts of my financial documents, my bank statements, my investment portfolios. She'd been researching my net worth. She'd been calculating how much she stood to inherit. The detective brought her to the police station for questioning. I was still in the hospital when I got the call from Detective Marquez. She told me that Oliella had confessed. She'd admitted to everything. She'd explained that her ex-husband had cleaned her out during the divorce. She'd lost her home, her savings, everything. She was desperate, drowning in debt, facing foreclosure on a property she'd already lost. She'd come to me thinking I would help her, but I'd told her I couldn't enable her by paying off her debts. I told her she needed to face the consequences of her choices, that I couldn't be her financial safety net. She'd been angry, resentful, and then she'd thought of another solution. According to her confession, she'd researched poisons online. She'd learned about thallium, about how it worked, about how long it would take to accumulate in someone's system. She'd ordered it through an underground website using cryptocurrency to hide the transaction. She'd started adding small amounts to my food, testing to see if I'd notice, adjusting the doses when I didn't. She'd planned to continue until I was dead. Then she'd inherit my estate, worth approximately $3 million. She'd calculated that she could pay off her debts, keep enough to live comfortably, and start fresh. All of this for money. All of this because she was angry with me for not bailing her out of her own financial crisis. I sat in the hospital bed, listening to Detective Marquez explain my daughter's confession, and I felt something inside me break. Not my body. My body was already broken, already poisoned, already damaged by months of accumulated toxins. Something deeper broke. Some fundamental belief I had about the world, about family, about love and trust, and the bonds that were supposed to be unbreakable. My hands started shaking. I couldn't control it. The nurse came in and adjusted my IV, adding something to help me relax. I didn't resist. I wanted to feel numb. I wanted to not feel anything at all. The hospital kept me for 2 weeks while they treated the thallium poisoning. The protocol was aggressive. They used activated charcoal. They administered medications to help my body eliminate the toxin. They monitored my organ function constantly. Rayton Stewart visited me every day, explaining what was happening, answering my questions, helping me understand the damage that had been done to my body. Some of it would heal. My hair would grow back. My nails would eventually become strong again. My skin would clear up. But there was permanent damage too. My kidneys had been affected. My nervous system had taken a hit. There were neurological symptoms that might persist indefinitely: tremors, occasional confusion, sensitivity to certain stimuli. I was 58 years old, and I would spend the rest of my life dealing with the consequences of my daughter's attempt to murder me for money. The case went to trial 3 months later. Oliella pleaded guilty to attempted murder, poisoning, and fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. The toxicology reports, the poison found in her room, her detailed notes, her research history, her confession, it all pointed to premeditated, calculated attempted homicide. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in prison. She'd be in her 50s when she got out, if she ever did. She'd lost everything: her freedom, her relationship with me, any chance at a normal life. I testified during the trial, though I didn't have to, given her guilty plea. I sat in the witness box and looked at my daughter across the courtroom. She didn't meet my eyes. She stared down at the table in front of her, her expression blank, her body language suggesting she'd already checked out emotionally from the proceedings. I told the court about the months of illness, the confusion, the fear. I told them about the moment I realized that the person I trusted most had been trying to kill me. I told them about the betrayal, the violation, the fundamental shattering of everything I believed about family and love and safety. When I was done, I stepped down from the witness box and walked past her. She still didn't look at me. Recovery was slow and complicated. I returned to work after a month, but I couldn't focus. I'd make mistakes that I'd never made before. I'd second-guess myself constantly. I'd developed an anxiety that manifested physically. My heart would race at unexpected moments. My hands would shake. My breathing would become shallow. I saw a therapist who specialized in trauma, and we worked through the psychological damage alongside the physical healing. But there was another layer to this that took longer to process. I had to rebuild my relationship with trust. I had to learn to be in my home without feeling like it was contaminated, poisoned, unsafe. I had to figure out how to move forward with the knowledge that my own child had tried to kill me. There's no instruction manual for that. There's no support group for mothers whose daughters attempted to murder them. There's just the long, painful work of learning to live with it. The financial aspect was complicated too. I'd had to hire lawyers to manage the legal proceedings. I'd had medical bills from the hospitalization and ongoing treatment. I'd had to take time off work, losing income. The financial impact was significant, but I was fortunate enough to have resources to absorb it. Many people wouldn't have been so lucky. That realization added another layer to my understanding of what had happened. Oliella's desperation had been real. Her financial crisis had been genuine. But instead of reaching out for help, instead of being honest about her struggles, she'd decided that murder was the solution. I spent a lot of time thinking about where I'd failed as a mother. Had I not been supportive enough? Had I been too harsh about her financial situation? Had I not shown enough compassion? I discussed these questions with my therapist extensively. She helped me understand that Oliella's choices were her own. I couldn't have prevented this by being a different mother, by handling things differently, by being more generous or more understanding. At some point, people make their own decisions about who they're going to be and what they're willing to do. Oliella had made hers. But that didn't stop me from grieving. I grieved the daughter I thought I had. I grieved the relationship we'd had. I grieved the future I'd imagined for us. Those things were gone now, poisoned just as surely as my body had been poisoned, just as my sense of safety had been poisoned. 6 months after the trial ended, I made some significant changes to my life. I sold the house. I couldn't live there anymore. Every room carried the memory of what had happened within those walls. Every meal felt like a potential threat. I found a new place, a smaller condo in a different part of the city. I furnished it from scratch, creating an environment that felt fresh and new and untainted by the past. I also made changes at work. I took a leave of absence that turned into early retirement. I was only 58, but I couldn't imagine going back to the high-stress environment of financial advising. I couldn't trust my judgment anymore. More importantly, I didn't want to. I wanted to step away from the life I'd been living and figure out who I wanted to be in this next chapter. I started volunteering at a poison control center, working with Rayton Stewart, the toxicologist who'd helped save my life. I wanted to use my experience to help others. I wanted to educate people about the dangers of poisoning, about the signs to watch for, about how to protect themselves. I wanted to make sure that what happened to me didn't happen to someone else. It was meaningful work, and it gave me a sense of purpose that my previous career never had. I also started a support group for people who'd been poisoned or who'd survived attempted murder by someone close to them. We met once a week in a community center, a small group of survivors trying to make sense of the betrayals that had shaped our lives. There was Islena, who'd been poisoned by her husband over the course of 5 years. There was Viana, whose brother had tried to kill her with contaminated medication. There was Hadiara, whose best friend had been slowly poisoning her coffee every morning before work. We shared our stories, our fears, our struggles with trust and recovery. We held each other accountable as we worked to rebuild our lives. The physical symptoms improved gradually. My hair grew back thicker and healthier than before. My nails became strong again. The rashes cleared up. But the neurological symptoms persisted. I developed a slight tremor in my left hand that became more pronounced when I was stressed or tired. I had occasional episodes of confusion, moments when my memory seemed to glitch and I'd lose track of time or forget what I was doing. My doctor assured me that these symptoms would likely improve over time, but they might never completely disappear. I'd have to learn to live with them, to work around them, to adjust my expectations for myself. The hardest part was the trust issue. After everything that had happened, I struggled to believe that anyone had good intentions. When someone offered to cook for me, I felt a spike of anxiety. When someone wanted to spend time with me alone, I felt suspicious. When someone asked about my financial situation, I felt defensive and paranoid. I had to actively work against these instincts, reminding myself that most people weren't trying to poison me, that most people weren't plotting against me, that most people were just living their lives and trying to be kind. I started dating again about a year after the trial. I was terrified. The idea of letting someone new into my life, of being vulnerable, of trusting someone with my physical safety and my emotional well-being seemed impossible. But my therapist encouraged me to try, to take small steps, to test the waters. I met Camer through a dating app. He was a retired teacher, kind and patient, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. I was honest with him about what had happened. I told him about Oliela, about the poisoning, about my struggles with trust. He listened without judgment. He didn't try to fix it or minimize it. He just listened and accepted me as I was, broken in some ways, but still here, still fighting, still trying to move forward. We took things slowly, very slowly. We went on dates in public places where I felt safe. We talked for hours about everything except the poisoning. I wanted to know him as a person separate from my trauma. I wanted to build something that wasn't defined by what had happened to me. It took months before I felt comfortable enough to have him cook for me. When he finally did, I sat in the kitchen and watched him prepare the meal. I helped with some of the cooking. I was present and engaged rather than anxious and suspicious. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. 2 years after the poisoning was discovered, I was in a much better place. My health had stabilized. The tremor in my hand was barely noticeable most days. The episodes of confusion had become rare. I'd built a new life that felt meaningful and authentic. I was working with the Poison Control Center, running the support group, spending time with Camer, reconnecting with friends I'd neglected during my years of financial advising. I was sleeping better, I was eating without fear. I was learning to trust again, not blindly, but thoughtfully, with awareness and caution, but also with openness and hope. I thought about Oliela sometimes. I wondered how she was doing in prison, whether she'd found any sense of redemption or understanding about what she'd done. I wondered if she regretted it. I wondered if she'd ever be able to forgive herself, and if she did, whether I'd ever be able to forgive her. The answer to that last question was still unclear. I didn't hate her anymore. The anger had burned itself out over time. But I didn't feel love either. I felt something more complicated, more painful. I felt the loss of the daughter I thought I had, combined with a kind of resigned acceptance that she was never going to be that person. I received a letter from her about 3 years after the trial. She'd been in prison for 2 years at that point. She wrote that she was sorry, that she'd been in therapy, that she understood now how sick she'd been, how twisted her thinking had become. She wrote that she wasn't asking for forgiveness, just for acknowledgement that she was trying to be better, that she was trying to understand herself and what had driven her to such desperate measures. She wrote that she loved me, that she'd always loved me, and that she was deeply sorry for what she'd done. I read the letter multiple times. I cried. I was angry. I was sad. I was confused. I didn't write back. I wasn't ready for that kind of reconciliation. Maybe I never would be. But I kept the letter. I put it in a drawer in my nightstand, and sometimes when I was having a difficult day, I'd take it out and read it again. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't erase the trauma or the damage or the betrayal. But it suggested that somewhere inside my daughter, there was still the capacity for remorse and growth and change. That small seed of hope was something I could hold on to. The support group continued to meet every week. We grew from 5 members to 12. We added new people regularly: survivors of poisoning, attempted murder, financial exploitation, emotional abuse. We created a space where people could come and be heard, where their experiences were validated, where they didn't have to pretend to be fine or put on a brave face. We shared resources, information, coping strategies. We celebrated small victories and supported each other through setbacks. I became the unofficial leader of the group, though I never intended to. People looked to me because I'd survived, because I'd rebuilt my life, because I'd found meaning and purpose after the trauma. But I was careful not to position myself as having all the answers. I was still figuring things out. I was still healing. I was still learning how to live in a world where the people closest to you could hurt you in the most fundamental ways. One of the members of the group was a woman named Esmera, who'd been poisoned by her husband over the course of a decade. She'd endured far worse than I had: more extensive physical damage, more prolonged psychological abuse, more complete financial exploitation. But she had this incredible resilience, this determination to not let what had happened define her. She'd left her husband, rebuilt her life, started a non-profit organization dedicated to helping domestic abuse survivors. She was an inspiration to everyone in the group, including me. One evening, after a support group meeting, Esmera pulled me aside and asked if I'd be interested in speaking at a conference about poisoning and trauma. There were medical professionals, law enforcement, social workers, and survivors all coming together to share information and experiences. She thought my story would be powerful, that it could help people understand the psychological and physical impacts of this kind of betrayal. I was terrified of public speaking, but I said yes. I wanted to use my experience to help others. I wanted to make sure that what I'd been through wasn't just a tragedy, but also a catalyst for positive change. I spent weeks preparing my speech. I worked with Rayton Stewart to make sure I was accurate about the medical aspects. I worked with my therapist to figure out how much personal detail to share. I practiced in front of the mirror, in front of camera, in front of the support group. I refined my message, tightened my language, made sure I was communicating clearly and powerfully. The conference was held in a large hotel in the city. There were hundreds of people in attendance. I stood backstage, waiting to go on, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. I could hear the moderator introducing me, telling the audience about my experience. And then, it was time. I walked out onto the stage, looked out at all those faces, and I began to speak. I told them about the months of illness, the confusion, the fear. I told them about the moment I realized that my daughter had been poisoning me. I told them about the investigation, the trial, the conviction. I told them about the recovery, the physical healing, the psychological work, the long journey back to some semblance of normalcy. I told them about the support group, about the community of survivors I'd built, about how important it was to have people who understood what you'd been through. But more than that, I told them about resilience. I told them that it was possible to survive something like this and still have a meaningful life. I told them that healing wasn't linear, that there would be good days and bad days, that setbacks didn't mean failure. I told them that trust could be rebuilt, that relationships could be repaired or reimagined, that it was possible to move forward without forgetting what had happened. I told them that I was still here, that despite everything, despite the poisoning and the betrayal and the trauma, I was still standing. I was still fighting. I was still choosing to believe in the possibility of goodness and connection and love, even though I'd been hurt in the most fundamental way. When I finished speaking, the audience stood and applauded. I saw people wiping tears from their faces. I saw people nodding in recognition of their own experiences. I saw people looking at me like I was some kind of hero, and I wanted to tell them that I wasn't. I was just a woman who'd survived something terrible and was trying to figure out how to live with it. After the speech, people came up to me wanting to talk. A woman named Caroline told me that her sister had been poisoned, and she'd thought her sister was just being paranoid and dramatic about it. Hearing my story made her realize she needed to apologize, to believe her sister, to support her in her recovery. A man named Sekhem told me that he'd been considering suicide because he couldn't get past the trauma of being poisoned by his wife. But hearing me talk about recovery and rebuilding had given him hope. An elderly woman named Ha told me that she'd been poisoned by her caregiver and hadn't told anyone because she was ashamed. But my speech had given her the courage to come forward and report it. I realized in that moment that my suffering had meaning. It wasn't just something that had happened to me. It was something that could help other people. It was something that could create change, awareness, understanding. It didn't erase the pain, but it transformed it into something useful, something purposeful, something that mattered. I continued speaking at conferences and community events. I did interviews for podcasts and radio shows. I wrote articles about poisoning and trauma for medical journals and survivor advocacy websites. I worked with law enforcement to help them understand the psychological patterns of people who poison their family members. I consulted with hospitals about how to better identify and treat poisoning victims. I became, somewhat unexpectedly, an expert in the field of poisoning and recovery. 4 years after the poisoning was discovered, I was invited to speak at a medical school. I stood in front of a classroom full of future doctors and told them about my experience. I explained what the symptoms of poisoning look like, how easy it is to miss if you're not looking for it, how important it is to listen to patients when they report unusual symptoms. I told them about the importance of taking seriously any concerns about food tampering, or unusual illness patterns. I told them that poisoning is often a crime of intimacy. It's usually someone close to the victim, someone with access to their food and drink, someone they trust. One of the students raised her hand and asked if I'd ever considered prosecuting my daughter for anything beyond the poisoning. I explained that she'd been charged with attempted murder and poisoning, and those charges carried significant prison time. She was serving her sentence. I didn't think additional charges would serve any purpose. What I wanted was for her to understand what she'd done, to take responsibility for it, to work on becoming a better person. Whether that was possible, I didn't know. But I wasn't going to spend my energy trying to punish her further. I was going to spend my energy rebuilding my own life and helping others do the same. 5 years after the poisoning was discovered, I was in a completely different place than I'd been when I was lying in that hospital bed, learning that my daughter had been slowly killing me. I'd healed as much as I was going to heal. The tremor in my hand was barely noticeable anymore. The episodes of confusion had stopped. The physical symptoms had resolved. I'd built a new career that felt meaningful and authentic. I'd rebuilt my capacity to trust, to be vulnerable, to let people into my life. I'd developed a relationship with Camer that was deep and real and based on genuine connection rather than fear or need. I'd also developed a complicated but genuine relationship with my daughter's memory. Not her, as she was, but the idea of her, the potential she'd had before her desperation and her resentment had twisted her into someone capable of attempted murder. I'd forgiven her in the sense that I wasn't angry anymore, but I hadn't forgotten what she'd done. I'd accepted that some relationships, once broken in such a fundamental way, couldn't be repaired. And I'd made peace with that acceptance. The support group had grown to 30 members. We'd formalized it into a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping survivors of poisoning and intimate partner violence. We'd secured funding from grants and donations. We'd hired staff. We'd expanded our services to include counseling, medical consultations, legal advocacy, and educational programming. We'd helped hundreds of people navigate the trauma of being poisoned by someone they trusted. I sat in my office at the nonprofit one afternoon, reviewing applications for new group members, when I received a phone call from the prison. Oliella had been transferred to a minimum security facility because of her good behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. The prison counselor wanted to know if I'd be interested in participating in a restorative justice program. Oliella had expressed a desire to meet with me, to have a conversation about what she'd done and how it had impacted both of us. The counselor explained that it was completely voluntary on my part, that I had no obligation to participate, that I should only do it if I felt ready and safe. I told the counselor I'd think about it and get back to them. I spent the next week thinking about whether I wanted to see Oliella. The idea of being in the same room with her, of hearing her voice, of looking into her face, it all felt terrifying and impossible. But it also felt like something I needed to do. Not for her, but for me. I needed to see who she'd become, whether she'd genuinely changed, whether there was any possibility of some kind of reconciliation, or at least understanding. I talked to my therapist about it extensively. We discussed the risks, the potential benefits, the ways I could protect myself emotionally if things went badly. We role-played different scenarios, different things Oliella might say, different ways I might respond. I talked to Camer about it. He was supportive but cautious, wanting me to do what felt right for me, but also concerned about my safety and well-being. I talked to the support group about it. Esmera had done a restorative justice program with her ex-husband, and she shared her experience. She said it had been one of the most difficult things she'd ever done, but it had also been transformative. It had allowed her to express the full impact of what he'd done to her, and it had allowed him to truly understand the damage he'd caused. She said it didn't mean she'd forgiven him or that they were going to have a relationship, but it had given her a sense of closure and completion that she hadn't had before. I decided to do it. The meeting was arranged for a month later. I was given the option to have a facilitator present, and I chose to have one. I was given the option to have someone I trusted in the room with me, and I chose to have camera present. I was given the option to end the meeting at any time if I felt unsafe or overwhelmed, and I was assured that I could do so without any consequences or judgment. The day of the meeting, I dressed carefully. I wanted to feel strong and grounded. I wanted to feel like myself, like the woman I'd become after everything I'd been through. I drove to the prison with Kamer beside me. He held my hand during the drive, not speaking, just being present. When we arrived, I was searched, my belongings were stored, and I was led to a small room with a table and several chairs. The facilitator, a woman named Mialina, explained the process. She would be there to help manage the conversation, to make sure it stayed constructive and safe. Oliela would be brought in, and then we would have the space to talk. When Oliela walked in, I barely recognized her. She'd been in prison for 5 years. She looked older, harder, worn down by the experience. Her hair was shorter. Her face was thinner. She looked at me with an expression that combined hope and fear and deep, profound regret. She sat down across from me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she began to talk. She told me about the years she'd spent in prison, about the therapy she'd done, about the work she'd undertaken to understand why she'd done what she'd done. She talked about her divorce, about the financial crisis, about the desperation and anger and resentment that had built up inside her. She talked about how she'd convinced herself that what she was doing was justified, that I deserved it because I hadn't helped her, because I'd been unsupportive. She talked about how her thinking had become increasingly distorted, increasingly focused on the idea that if I died, all her problems would be solved. She talked about the moment she'd realized what she was doing, the moment she'd understood that she was attempting to murder her own mother. She said it had been like waking up from a nightmare, except the nightmare was real. She said she'd wanted to stop, but by that point, the poison was already in my system, and she'd been too afraid to come forward. She said she'd been living with the guilt and shame of her actions every single day since. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face and said, "I'm so sorry, Mom. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know that doesn't undo what I did. But I need you to know that I understand now. I understand the enormity of what I tried to do. I understand that I tried to kill you. And I'm horrified by that. I'm horrified by who I was, by what I was capable of." I sat there listening to her, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly, not reconciliation, but understanding. I understood now that she hadn't been trying to hurt me personally. She'd been trying to solve a problem, and her desperation and her twisted thinking had led her to the most extreme solution possible. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained it. It gave it context. It made her human again, instead of just a villain in my story. I told her about the impact of what she'd done. I told her about the months of illness, the fear, the confusion. I told her about the hospitalization, the treatment, the physical damage that would probably never fully heal. I told her about the psychological impact, the difficulty trusting people, the anxiety, the nightmares. I told her about having to leave my home, having to change my career, having to rebuild my entire life from scratch. I told her about the support group, about the other survivors I'd met, about how her actions had rippled out and affected not just me, but everyone around me. I watched her listen to all of this. watched the weight of it settle on her shoulders, watched her understand in a deeper way what she'd done. And then I told her something that surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise her. "I forgive you," I said. "Not because what you did was okay, not because I'm going to pretend it didn't happen or that it didn't hurt me, but because I can't carry this anger anymore. It's too heavy. It's too poisonous. And I deserve to be free from it. So I'm choosing to forgive you, not for your sake, but for mine." Oliela broke down completely. She sobbed, her whole body shaking with the release of years of guilt and shame. The facilitator handed her tissues. Cameron squeezed my hand. I sat there watching my daughter fall apart, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Compassion. Not the compassion of a mother for a child, exactly, but the compassion of one human being for another who'd made terrible choices and had to live with the consequences. When Oliela had composed herself, I told her that I didn't think we could have the kind of relationship we'd had before. That was gone. That couldn't be repaired. But I said I was open to the possibility of some kind of relationship in the future, after she was released from prison, after she'd had more time to work on herself and to understand her actions more deeply. I said it would take time and trust building, and there were no guarantees. But the possibility was there if she wanted to work toward it. Oliela nodded. She said she understood. She said she didn't expect anything from me. She just wanted me to know that she was sorry, that she was working to become a better person, that she would spend the rest of her life trying to make amends for what she'd done, even if she never fully could. When the meeting ended, I stood up and surprised myself by hugging her. It was brief, awkward, uncomfortable, but it was something. It was a gesture that said I saw her as human, that I acknowledged the work she was doing to change, that I was willing to move forward even if I couldn't forget what had happened. I walked out of the prison with Cameron, and I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of the anger and the resentment and the need for revenge had lifted. I could breathe more easily. I could think more clearly. I could move forward without carrying the past quite so heavily on my shoulders. The years that followed were about consolidation and growth. I continued my work with the nonprofit. I continued speaking at conferences and events. I continued running the support group. I continued building my life with Cameron. And I maintained a tentative connection with Oliela through letters and occasional phone calls. She was released from prison after serving 7 years of her 15-year sentence due to good behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. She moved to a different city, started working in a restaurant, began taking classes at a community college. She was building a new life, just as I had. We met for coffee about 6 months after her release. It was awkward at first, but we fell into conversation naturally. She asked about my work. I asked about her classes. We talked about neutral topics, the weather, the news, books we'd been reading. We didn't talk about the poisoning or the prison or the years we'd lost. But the fact that we could sit together, without that being the only thing between us, felt significant. Over time, we developed a careful, measured relationship. We weren't close the way we'd been before. We probably never would be. But we were connected by the shared history of what had happened, by the work we'd both done to move past it, by the understanding that we were both trying to be better people. It wasn't the relationship I would have chosen, but it was the relationship we'd built, and it was real and meaningful in its own way. 10 years after the poisoning was discovered, I was invited to write a book about my experience. A publisher thought my story could help people understand poisoning, trauma, recovery, and the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation. I spent a year working on the manuscript, carefully crafting my narrative, making sure I was being honest and authentic, while also being mindful of other people's privacy and dignity. The book was published and became a bestseller in the self-help and true crime categories. It led to more speaking engagements, more media appearances, more opportunities to help people who'd been through similar experiences. I was 58 when I discovered that my daughter had been poisoning me. I'm now 68, a full decade later. I've lived a second life in that time, a life that's been richer and more meaningful in many ways than my first life was. I've learned that trauma can be transformed into purpose. I've learned that betrayal can lead to deeper understanding of human nature and human capacity for both cruelty and redemption. I've learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing what someone did. It's about choosing not to let their actions continue to poison you. The support group still meets every week. We've helped thousands of people navigate the trauma of poisoning and intimate partner violence. We've trained law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and social workers about how to identify and support poisoning survivors. We've changed policies in hospitals and police departments. We've saved lives. And it all started because someone tried to kill me and failed. I think about what would have happened if I'd gone to a different doctor that day, if I'd been misdiagnosed, if I'd continued to deteriorate until the poisoning became fatal. I think about how close I came to being a statistic, another unsolved death attributed to natural causes, another family tragedy that could have been prevented. I think about how grateful I am that the doctors took my symptoms seriously, that the toxicologist was thorough, that the investigation was comprehensive, that justice was served. But more than that, I think about how grateful I am to still be here, to still be able to work and speak and help people, to still be able to build relationships and experience joy and find meaning in my life, to still be able to forgive, to grow, to change, to become a better version of myself. The poison that Oliella put in my food didn't kill me, but it did change me. It broke me open in ways that I've spent the last decade learning to understand and integrate. And in that breaking, I found something valuable. I found purpose. I found community. I found the capacity to help others navigate their own darkness and find their way back to the light. If you or someone you know has experienced poisoning or intimate partner violence, please reach out for help. There are resources available. There are people who understand what you're going through. There is a path forward. Even when it doesn't feel like it, you are not alone.